This game is so fun. The only problem is the dang controller. I just wish it was more good. Oh, that's why I rage so much. Video game controllers. Some are good, some are bad, and some are just flat out unplayable. Today, Rex, Andrew, and I are going to review a bunch of controllers. Stay tuned because there are going to be quite a lot of them. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you can help me reach 50 subscribers because I have something very special planned. Anyway, let's get started with one of the first controllers on the market, the Atari controller. First up on the list, we have the Atari 2600 controller. This controller's design is a bit minimalistic, featuring only a stick and a button. And that's about it. The stick moves in 4 directions, up, down, left, and right, while the button presses down for 1 button press. Let's go! Hooray! This controller is one of the earliest controllers I can think of for any game system, actually, coming out in 1977 along the release of the Atari 2600, one of the first game systems. You ever heard of an upgrade? The NES controller is a total upgrade from what we have with the Atari 2600 controller. Instead of having one of those dumb old stick things, we actually have a D-pad now, and the D-pad, just gotta say, this feels great. Now, I don't own one of these controllers, but I've used one before, and I know that the D-pad feels great, okay? There's an A and a B button this time, not only one button. And it also includes start and select buttons, something that we just didn't have with the Atari 2600 controller. And I gotta just say this right now. The whole controller's design is it fits in your hand so perfectly. Not as much as later consoles, but still, I would totally play with this if I had to. The Super Nintendo controller. Well, the name doesn't lie because it is just a superb version of the Nintendo controller. Now, I don't have one on me, but I do have one of these really bad off-brand controllers that I can show you. It has all of the original buttons that the NES controller had, except it includes 4 more. The L button, the R button, the X, and the Y buttons. Overall, I'd say if you're looking to play Mario World or Mario Kart on the SNES, this is the definitive way to go. Moving on now to the Sega Genesis controller, but notice I skipped the Master System controller because I'm actually going to cover every single video game controller ever in a different video, so I just wanted to stick to the major controllers in this video. Nevertheless, it's the Sega Genesis controller, featuring a D-pad with 8 directions, up, down, left, and right, and 4 diagonal directions. Instead of 4 buttons, it actually has 3, A, B, and C, instead of A, B, X, and Y like Nintendo was doing with their Super Nintendo. And it also has 1 start button, no select, no L and R. That's all you got. But alas, the Sega Genesis was mainly an arcade gaming console, bringing arcade games back to your home at your couch and your TV and stuff. So, a 3-button controller isn't really the greatest option to go with if you're going to play games that require generally 4, 5, or even 6 buttons. So, Sega, being the Sega that they are, just went out and made a 6-button Genesis controller. Now, I don't own one of these, but from what I can tell, it's the same exact thing, just with 6 buttons instead of 3. And, yeah, that's all I gotta say. The PlayStation controller, what we would like to call the first modern appearance of thighs on a controller. Basically, every controller before it never came with thighs. The closest controller that did come with thighs was basically the Sega Genesis, and those weren't thighs, they were nubs. PlayStation controller actually introduced the thighs that you put your hands on to rest as you're pressing the buttons and moving the analog sticks and D-pad. It was actually a really revolutionary thing to add, as many gamers today still use controllers with thighs, and the ones that don't, what's wrong with you? Everyone else picked up on the trends, such as the GameCube, Xbox, PS2, the PlayStation 2 was just a successor, but you know what I mean. The PlayStation controller was revolutionary for many other ways, such as the back buttons. It included L1 and R1, such as the Super Nintendo included, but it also added R2 and L2. So that's a combination of 4 back buttons on the back of the controller that you can use. Now this was revolutionary for shooting games, as you could switch your weapons with R1 and L2, and then you could shoot using the 2 other back buttons. Now that's just revolutionary. Now the front of the PS1 controller is, well, pretty bland, as it included a D-pad, which the Super Nintendo included, and start and select buttons, which the Super Nintendo included, and 4 front-facing buttons. Those being circle, square, triangle, and X, which basically were the same as the Super Nintendo, so like the Super Nintendo in many ways, but also kinda different, adding the thighs and the 2 extra back buttons. Now hold on to your helmet, bucko, this isn't the final PlayStation controller, as this controller is. This is called the DualShock controller, and it's the controller most people think of when they think of PlayStation. Adding the 2 analog sticks on the front for your thumbs to use, widening the thighs a little bit so it's easier to hold in your hands, and thickening the 2 extra back buttons, L2 and R2. Now this controller, I gotta say, I just like it a lot better than the original one, but if I'm gonna play games that don't require the analog sticks, you know I'm gonna go back to the OG one. You know, I'm that OG kind of guy. The N64 controller, also known as the first controller I ever used for any major game console, as the N64 was my first game console. Coming out with the launch of the N64 back in 1996, the N64 controller. It's kind of an oddball too, because it has 3 thighs, and for the time, people were still getting used to 2 thighs with the PlayStation 1 controller. This controller includes 3 thighs, as I just stated, 1 thigh in the middle, 2 thighs on the outside. Now, people mainly use the middle thigh and the right side thigh to mainly play their games, but only a few selected games use the left thigh, because that's just the thigh with the D-pad on it. And now, why would you use that if you had your horrible analog stick in the middle? Ugh. Moving on to the right side of the controller now, there are 6 buttons, A, B, up, down, left, and right C-stick buttons, and that's about it. When I think of this side of this controller, I kind of think of the Genesis second controller design, as it has 6 buttons resembling that controller, so that's my connection. Moving on to the back side of the controller, this is where I just love the N64 controller, because there is one button that just changes the deal for everyone. If this button wasn't included in the controller, I feel like many people would actually be turned off by it. The Z button, it's a trigger, so in many games it actually serves it well, 007 being an example, as that's your firing button, and it actually is amazing. Moving on to the 2 buttons that are kind of stale by now, the L and R buttons. Now, Nintendo didn't want to go with all the trends at the time, including only 2 L and R buttons, not 4, so that was kind of risky on their part. Personally, I think that this controller was a risk for Nintendo to put out at the time, as they were kind of relying on the Super Nintendo's success for money at that point, and when the N64 came out, it didn't do as well as they hoped, because mainly the controller wasn't that great. But you grow to like it as time goes on if you play with it that much, as I did with Mario 64, and I actually got used to it fairly quickly. Oh look, Sega's back in the market with their new console, the Dreamcast, after this monstrosity happened. Well, the Dreamcast controller does take some inspiration from the Sega Saturn controller, as it shares the same design and overall button layout, but it does add some few key features. And when I say shares the overall button layout, I mean the buttons are in the same place, but it's not really at all the same. Enter the Sega Dreamcast. It has 4 buttons on the front, A, B, X, and Y. It's kinda like Nintendo. It has 1 D-pad. It's not that great. It resembles the Xbox 360's, which is oof. It has a start button in the middle, shaped like a triangle, and 1 joystick on the left. It's not very pleasant to use though, as it's made out of pure plastic, hard plastic and it doesn't have any rubber padding on it either, so your fingers just constantly rubbing on it, and it hurts my thumb after a while. It has 2 buttons on the back, L and R, which is kind of standard by now, and the one key feature of this controller over being a subpar controller is the VMU. It's basically just a little computer that fits into the controller to display your save data, maybe some games, or you can take it on the go to play different little games off your favorite games on your Dreamcast. It's basically just a Game Boy, but kinda lacking. One thing I just don't understand why they did with this controller was put the cord coming out the bottom of the controller. For most controllers at the time, the controller would come out the top because, you know, that's how you play. You don't play upside down with the console going behind you. That's just dumb. So Sega just put the cord on the bottom, and then on the back of the controller they added like a little indent for you to shove the wire in to make it go at the top. That's not the ideal way to play video games at all. The PlayStation 2! You ever heard of inverted colors? Yeah, the PlayStation 2 controller is kinda just a clone of the PlayStation 1's DualShock controller. The only difference being that it's black, and I'm pretty sure you can actually buy a PlayStation 1 analog controller that's black, so not much of an advantage here except for being a PlayStation 2 compatible controller, which I'm pretty sure the PlayStation 1 analog controller is. The GameCube controller. Coming out in 2001 along the release of the GameCube, it had 2 L and R buttons on the back, obviously, because, you know, it's the standard by now. It also included the Z button this time around, which is basically just another R button, but that's okay. It includes a joystick, which is, again, the standard by now, also with a D-pad, a C-stick, which is something that we would see with the release of the N64, but now in joystick form, A, B, X, and Y buttons, with the B being smaller than the A button, and the X and Y buttons being kinda weirdly shaped, but oddly comfortable to press, and the start button. This controller also has rumble built into it, which is something pretty cool. So yeah, that's the GameCube controller.
Hey look, Microsoft's in the gaming market with their new console, the Xbox, and their controller. There's a reason why this thing is called the Duke. The original circuit board was the size of a large dinner plate and had to be cut down to fit the normal game controller look. This controller still is an oddball though. The sticks are okay, the analog circuits are a nice touch, but the face buttons look like they've been stretched out, and we got an inverted dome for a D-pad, which is interesting. But I had this controller. This controller was for the Xbox in Japan, which was brought over to the USA later in its lifespan. It's a bit smaller compared to the original. The face buttons are normal. The sticks are now the same size and texture, and it finally has a D-pad. This controller is okay, and it's definitely an improvement from the original, but it definitely shows that this was Microsoft's first console and could definitely need improvement.
Hey, is that an Xbox 360 controller I see in the distance? Oh wow, an Xbox 360 controller. I remember it being introduced on November 22nd, 2005. This console finally made it easier for families and friends to get together and have some fun.
But what about the people who—
Shh! We have better things to discuss. Oh yeah, the The Xbox 360 was another one of those consoles that was introduced to new types of players, new games, a new controller design, and much more. Remember those kids who would jump on it and play it once they got home? And the ones like me who ate chapstick while watching my dad play Lego Star Wars?
No one remembers doing that.
What is this in your eye? The Xbox 360 has a similar design to the Xbox original design that Andrew talked about earlier, with all the same buttons, but this time it includes 2 more shoulder buttons, the left bumper and the right bumper.
So, like, are you gonna ever talk about the D-pad?
I'm getting there! The D-pad on the Xbox 360 is, well, not good. It's very squishy and it just feels horrible. Some perks of having the Xbox 360's controllers being able to play some Halo Wars 3. That game was awesome. So was Minecraft, Call of Duty, and a whole bunch of arcade titles. These games felt comfortable in my hand while I played, which is a great aspect. Now onto the PS3. This controller and console came out on November 11, 2006. This controller was a great step up from the PS2. It's pretty good, but I think the best part about it was the joysticks. The joysticks feel smooth and don't get sticky often. Another nice touch is the size of the controller. At first, it didn't really fit my hands at the time, but I think it was a nice addition for people with larger hands. This would have definitely fit them. Another upside to this controller is the battery pack. The amount of playtime you can get on this controller is absolutely great. It's really nice to have a good controller to play with if you're going to be playing for a long time. The controller is pretty great altogether and was built with the intention of a good controller. Yes, I'll admit again that controller wasn't made out of the greatest quality, but still, the main idea of the controller was executed well. Sadly, the one downside on this controller is the grip on the left or right triggers. Unlike the most recent controllers, these buttons still have a curve at the end of it, making your fingers prone to sliding off. Now, this isn't much of a problem if you keep a constant watch to keep your fingers on, but in reality, no one does that because their main focus is to play the game and press all the other buttons on the controller. Out of all honesty, there isn't much to say about this controller. It has a basic setup and isn't much different from all the other controllers. Well, now that I'm finished with this controller, it's time for the next one.
Moving on, we have the Wii, everyone's favorite motion control machine. I've talked about all the Wii controllers in JR's Wii video, so I'm just going to sum up my opinions. The Wii U, the Wii's disappointing younger brother. The gamepad is pretty comfortable. The triggers are big. The sticks are nice. It has a camera, NFC reader, TV remote, which are all surprisingly useful. Still, the gamepad can only last up to 3 to 5 hours. The screen is unnecessary in a lot of the games for the system, usually just showing a map on the screen. And even with bad battery life, it gets uncomfortable during long periods of use. But hey, if you want to keep playing for 3 days straight, get the Wii U Pro controller. But since the gamepad is used in most of the games, not a whole ton of games support this or work well with the controller. On top of that, the triggers are analog, and it feels uncomfortable sometimes due to the sticks on top of the controller, making the Wii U having okay controllers, I don't know, wasn't really that great.
The PS4, one of the newer consoles on the market. So different from the PS3, but the same in so many ways. With the research and experiences I've had with this controller, here are some pros and cons. First pro, the controller is very smooth. You would be surprised by the fact that the joysticks and the buttons and how they move perfectly. I'll have more with that later. 2. Now, this is kind of a pro, but the buttons are flat. You know how on the Xbox it has the curved buttons? Well, on the PS4 they're smooth. In my opinion, I think they're a bit better. Pro number 3. the quality. The quality is great. It's not just a cheap plastic used on most controllers. I'm not sure what they used to make it, but it works well with the feel of the controller in your hand, and it's perfect. It's a bit annoying when first shifting from Xbox to PlayStation, but it's not a big deal. Now, time for the cons. Woo. Con number 1. The controller doesn't last that long in good shape. From my experiences, the controller buttons get pretty squeaky after about a year or so, and for some reason the buttons stick from time to time. Now that may just be me, but it gets annoying when you're trying to play Metal Gear Solid and you have to hear every little sound for a mission, and then when you pull out your gun all you hear is that squeak from the buttons. That's annoying. Con number 2, the charger. Now you may have that fancy charger which you put on its little station, no problem, but for the rest of us, we have to use the wire. In all honesty, the wire isn't that durable. It gets tangled often and it's a hassle to keep nice. Because of the wire's poor quality, it tends not to charge sometimes, or even worse cases, it breaks the charger in the controller, which then you just have to buy a new controller. Con number 3, the lights. Yeah, at first glance, cool flashing lights on the controller. I mean, who wouldn't want that? But, it drains the battery faster. Yeah, it seems cool, but it's gonna get annoying after a while. You can't turn the lights off. Alright, that's all for the PS4. On to the next controller.
The Xbox One controller! Well, the Xbox One controller definitely stays true to the original formula of the last two consoles, as it's literally the same exact design, featuring the A, B, X, and Y buttons, 2 joysticks, back L and R buttons, and then L and R bumpers, the Xbox buttons, start and select, but this time, for some reason, start and select have been swapped with 3 lines and 2 boxes, but whatever. It also features a functioning D-pad this time. Oh boy, am I excited! And that's it. So yeah.
Now on to the newest console on the market, the Nintendo Switch, aka Nintendo Savior. After the disappointment that was the Wii U, Nintendo needed something new. They had a very tricky task for making controllers for the Switch. See, the controller needed to work in handheld mode, but also be comfortable enough in dock mode. And the result? These controllers are ridiculously small. I get they needed to work in portable mode, but people with bigger hands and using this in dock mode, they can get very uncomfortable very quick. So for playing in dock mode, you should always go for the Pro Controller. The Pro Controller is one of the best feeling controllers of all time, up there with the GameCube controller even. Everything just feels really nice about this controller. The buttons are big, the joysticks feel smooth, and the controller overall fits in your hands really well. The only downside is the D-pad can move in different directions at times, and the triggers aren't analog, but besides this is a great controller. But if you want a controller smaller than the Joy-Cons and can only work with basically one game for $50, there's the Pokeball Plus. This Pokeball-shaped controller only works for 2 games, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. There are only 2 buttons, one by clicking down the stick, which is A, while the hidden button at the top is B. But in the game, you can shake the controller to activate the Y button. The motion control works surprisingly well, and this is a very cool device, even if it's not the best way to play the game.
Well, that just about brings us back up to where we are today in the world of controllers, I guess. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Rex, Andrew, and I put about, 3 months into this video? So yeah, all that work paid off, I guess. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and hope you guys like the history of video game controllers up until now. So, see you guys next time.